Margaret stood frozen on the busy sidewalk, her wrinkled hands clutching a battered suitcase as she watched her son's car disappear into the distance. The sound of tires on asphalt was the last thing she heard before the deafening silence of her abandonment settled in. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat a reminder of the betrayal she never thought possible. "He's really gone," she thought, disbelief coursing through her as the realization hit. Her son, Richard, the boy she had raised with every ounce of love, sacrifice, and care she could muster, had left her. Not in a comfortable home or even a nearby city, but here, in a place she didn't know, far from anyone who could help her. At 70 years old, Margaret was stranded, vulnerable, and utterly alone. Her feet felt like lead, rooted to the pavement, as the world rushed around her. People passed by, indifferent to the woman who had just been discarded like old, useless luggage. It wasn't just the physical weight of her suitcase pulling her down, it was the crushing realization that the one person she had given everything to had walked away without a second glance. Richard hadn't looked back. His parting words, cold and calculated, echoed in her mind, "You'll be fine, Mom. Trust me." She had trusted him, had believed in him, but now she saw the truth: he had no intention of coming back. His ambitions, his failed investments, his constant need to climb higher had transformed him into someone she no longer recognized. He saw her as nothing more than a burden. A wave of panic surged through her as she stood on that unfamiliar street, surrounded by strangers. Margaret had faced hardship before: losing her husband, raising Richard on her own, working long hours as a seamstress to keep food on the table, but this was different. She was alone, in a city where she knew no one, with no money and no place to go. Her hands trembled as she gripped the suitcase tighter, feeling the familiar fray of the worn handle. For a moment, she considered calling out to someone, asking for help, but the words caught in her throat. What could they do? What could anyone do? Richard was gone, and she had to find a way to survive on her own. Margaret glanced around, her eyes darting from building to building, searching for something, anything, that could offer her a sense of direction. The city felt cold and foreign, its towering skyscrapers and crowded streets suffocating in their indifference. She had never been here before, and now it was clear that Richard had brought her here for one reason: to leave her behind. Her legs wobbled beneath her as the weight of the situation sank in. She couldn't stand here forever. Slowly, she made her way toward a small park nearby, the suitcase dragging behind her as if it were filled with all the regrets and pain of her past. The bench she found offered little comfort, but it was a place to sit, to catch her breath, and to think. Why? The question rang through her mind, over and over again. Why would he do this? How could he abandon me like this? She had always been proud of Richard's ambition, his drive to succeed, but somewhere along the way, that ambition had turned into something darker. She had seen the signs: his growing impatience, his distant behavior, the way he spoke about his business dealings with more urgency, more desperation. But she had never imagined it would lead to this. A tear slipped down her cheek as she remembered the little boy he used to be, the boy who clung to her hand when he was scared, who brought her flowers from the yard because he knew she loved their scent. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw her as an obstacle, a weight holding him back from his next big deal. Margaret wiped the tear away quickly. Crying wouldn't solve anything. She had always been strong, practical. She had faced loss before, and she would face this too. But the pain of being abandoned by her own son, that would take longer to heal. Her thoughts drifted to the sewing kit tucked away in her suitcase. It had been her constant companion throughout her life, a small box filled with needles, thread, scissors, and fabric scraps. It was the tool she had used to stitch together not just clothes, but her entire life. Through every hardship, every loss, she had turned to it, creating something beautiful out of whatever she had. Perhaps now, in this darkest moment, it would be the thing that saved her once again. But first, she needed to figure out where she was, and how she could survive. The little money she had left wouldn't last long. Her heart raced as she tried to formulate a plan, but her mind kept circling back to Richard. What was he thinking? She wondered. How could he just leave her, knowing she had nothing? The sharp memory of a conversation she'd overheard flashed in her mind. Months ago, Richard had been on the phone, speaking in hushed tones about debts, investments, and someone he owed. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Richard was always talking about business. But now, with the cold grip of fear tightening around her heart, she wondered if there had been something more. Something she had missed. Was I just in the way? She asked herself, feeling the ache of that possibility settle deep in her bones. Just as the panic threatened to overwhelm her, a voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Margaret looked up to see a young man standing in front of her, concern etched on his face. She tried to smile, to mask the fear and confusion swirling inside her, but she couldn't manage it. I don't know where I am," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My son. He left me here." The man's eyes softened, and he crouched down beside her. "Do you need help?" "I can call someone, or there's a shelter nearby if you need a place to stay." Margaret hesitated. Call someone? Who could she call? Richard had made sure of that. He was the only person she had left, and now he was gone. The thought of calling him, of begging for his help, turned her stomach. She didn't want his help. She didn't need it. "No," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. "I'll figure it out. Thank you." The young man stood, still looking unsure. "If you're sure. Take care, all right?" As he walked away, Margaret took a deep breath. She didn't know how she would survive, but she would. She had to. She wasn't going to let Richard win, wasn't going to let his abandonment break her. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the park. Margaret stood, gripping her suitcase tightly. She didn't know where she was headed, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't be defeated. Not by Richard, not by this city, and not by the fear gnawing at her insides. She was stronger than this. Margaret's resolve carried her only so far. The streets stretched endlessly ahead of her, every corner looking more foreign than the last. The city buzzed with activity, a constant hum of life that she felt utterly disconnected from. She walked for what felt like hours, her body growing heavier with each step, her mind racing as panic threatened to take over. She had no plan, no clear direction. All she had was the worn suitcase dragging behind her and the faint hope that she could somehow survive. The money in her purse was meager. She counted it twice, trying to stretch it in her mind, but no matter how many times she added it up, it wasn't enough. A few dollars, a couple of loose coins. Just enough for a cheap meal or a night in a shabby room, but not both. Margaret's heart clenched as she realized how close she was to being entirely without resources. At 70 years old, she was staring down the barrel of homelessness. As the daylight faded, the city began to take on a more menacing tone. The people walking past her seemed less friendly, more hurried. She could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere as businesses closed their doors and the streets became populated with those who had nowhere else to go. Margaret clutched her suitcase a little tighter, her stomach knotting with fear. She stopped at a small diner, its neon sign flickering in the dimming light. The smell of greasy food wafted through the open door, and despite the tension in her chest, her hunger gnawed at her. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the day's events had drained her energy. With hesitation, she stepped inside. The diner was nearly empty. A few people sat scattered at the counter, their eyes glued to their plates, lost in their own worlds. Margaret found a seat in the back, hoping to stay unnoticed. She ordered the cheapest item on the menu, a cup of coffee and a slice of toast, and handed over a couple of crumpled bills, her hands trembling. The waitress barely glanced at her as she took the money and disappeared into the kitchen. As Margaret waited, she couldn't stop the flood of thoughts racing through her mind. What if Richard never calls? What if I never see him again? The questions weighed heavily on her, each one more terrifying than the last. She had raised him with love, given him everything, and now he had abandoned her with nothing. Her thoughts were interrupted when the waitress returned, placing the coffee and toast in front of her with a thud. The cup rattled on the saucer, mirroring the tremor in Margaret's hands. She wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, hoping to steady herself. But the warmth did little to calm the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The minutes dragged on as she sipped the coffee, her mind clouded with doubt. She needed to come up with a plan, some way to find shelter, work, anything to keep her afloat. But every option seemed like a dead end. Who would hire a 70-year-old woman? She had spent her life sewing, working in a small shop where she knew her customers by name. Here, in this big, anonymous city, her skills felt inadequate, outdated. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to push the fear away. She had survived hard times before. She had raised a son on her own after her husband's death. She had endured long nights of work, stitching fabric by candlelight just to make ends meet. She had faced loss, grief, and loneliness before, but this felt different. This time, the betrayal was personal, cutting deeper than any hardship she had known. Her thoughts drifted back to Richard. What had gone so wrong? When had he stopped caring? She had noticed the change in him over the last few years, his growing obsession with money, with success. He had always been ambitious, always reaching for more, but recently that ambition had taken a darker turn. He had become distant, cold. He visited less often, and when he did, he was always distracted, always on his phone, talking about deals and investments she didn't understand. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. His decision to bring her here, to this strange city, hadn't been sudden. It had been planned. He had been distancing himself for months, preparing for this moment. Margaret's chest tightened as the realization hit her. This wasn't just abandonment. This was something more deliberate. Richard had wanted her out of his life, out of his way. But why? What could have driven him to do something so cruel? The memory of that overheard conversation, the one about debts and fixing things, came rushing back. Could it be that he was in trouble? Margaret's heart sank as a new fear took root. What if Richard's problems went deeper than she realized? What if he had left her here because he was running from something, someone? As she sat there, her unease growing, a voice cut through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am. You all right?" Margaret looked up to see the diner's manager standing over her, his expression hard to read. She forced a weak smile, trying to hide the fear that was gnawing at her insides. "Yes, I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. He didn't move, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been sitting here for a while. Everything okay?" Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks. She hadn't realized how long she'd been there, lost in her thoughts. The truth was, she didn't want to leave. The diner, though far from comforting, was at least a place to sit, a place where she didn't have to face the reality of her situation. "I'll be leaving soon," she said quickly, hoping to avoid further questions. The manager gave her a curt nod before turning and walking back to the counter. Margaret's hands gripped the cup a little tighter as she watched him go. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay anywhere, really. Not unless she found a way to make money fast. "I have to do something," she thought, the urgency of her situation sinking in fully. But what? Her mind went back to the only thing she knew how to do, sewing. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. If she could find a place that needed help, even just a few hours a day, it might be enough to get by. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. Margaret stood, gathering her suitcase and leaving the few coins she had left as a tip. She stepped out into the night, the air cool against her skin, and started walking again, this time with a purpose. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she needed to find a sewing shop, or something like it, before it was too late. The city at night was even more intimidating than during the day. The streets were quieter, but the shadows seemed longer, darker. Every corner felt like a new obstacle, every alley a potential threat. Margaret's heart raced as she walked, her eyes scanning the storefronts for any sign of a tailor or seamstress. But the city was vast, and nothing looked familiar. Hours passed, and Margaret's feet ached. Her body was exhausted, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spotted a small sign hanging above a narrow doorway, the stitchery. Her heart leapt with hope. She hurried across the street, her legs trembling from exhaustion. The shop was closed, its windows dark, but she peered inside, her breath fogging up the glass. It was a modest place, with a few sewing machines and bolts of fabric lining the walls. It wasn't much, but to Margaret, it looked like salvation. She stood there for a moment, staring at the sign, her mind racing with possibilities. If I could just get a foot in the door, she thought. If they need help, even for a few hours, it could be enough to keep me afloat. But the shop was closed, and Margaret was too tired to wait for morning. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment, and she knew she needed to find a place to rest. She glanced down the street, spotting a cheap motel sign flickering in the distance. It wasn't ideal, but it was a roof over her head for the night. With heavy feet, she made her way to the motel. The room she rented was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but Margaret didn't care. She collapsed onto the bed, her body aching from the long day. As she lay there in the darkness, her mind drifted back to Richard. "What have you done, Richard?" she wondered, her heart aching with both love and anger. "How did we end up here?" Sleep didn't come easily that night. Margaret tossed and turned, haunted by thoughts of her son, of the betrayal, of the uncertain future that lay ahead. But even in the midst of her fear, one thought remained clear: she couldn't give up. She had survived too much in her life to let this break her. The next morning, Margaret woke early, her body stiff and sore. She gathered her things and made her way back to the stitchery. The shop's door was unlocked now, and as she stepped inside, the familiar smell of fabric and thread filled the air. It was a small comfort in an otherwise overwhelming situation. Behind the counter stood a woman, perhaps in her 50s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. Margaret hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain her situation. She didn't want to seem desperate, but the truth was, she was desperate. I was wondering if you might need help," Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm a seamstress. I've been sewing for over 50 years. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. 50 years, huh? That's impressive. But we're a small shop, not much work to go around." Margaret's heart sank, but she pressed on. "I don't need much. Just a few hours a day. I'll take whatever you can offer." The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Let me see what I can do. We're always busy around the holidays, and I could use an extra pair of hands." Margaret exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It wasn't much, but it was something. A way forward. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means to me." The woman smiled. "You start tomorrow. Be here at 8. Margaret nodded, relief washing over her. It wasn't the end of her problems, not by a long shot, but it was a step in the right direction. She had found a way to survive, at least for now. And with each stitch, each thread, she would work toward rebuilding the pieces of her life that had been torn apart. But even as she stood there, a small flicker of hope in her heart, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's betrayal was far from over. Something darker was looming on the horizon, something that threatened to unravel everything she had fought so hard to hold on to. And she wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. The next few weeks passed in a blur of early mornings and long hours at the stitchery. Margaret found solace in the repetitive motion of needle and thread. Each stitch was a small act of defiance, a reminder that she still had control over something in her life. The rhythmic hum of the sewing machines, the familiar scent of fabric, the satisfaction of seeing her work come together, these small comforts helped her keep the panic at bay. But even as she settled into her new routine, a sense of unease lingered. Richard's betrayal still haunted her thoughts. The question of why gnawed at her relentlessly. What had driven her son to abandon her like that, in a strange city, without any explanation? And what was he hiding? The woman who ran the shop, Clara, had been kind to Margaret, offering her more hours as the holiday season approached. She didn't pry into Margaret's personal life, for which Margaret was grateful, but every now and then, Clara would ask a gentle question, trying to understand the older woman's situation. Margaret had learned to sidestep these inquiries with vague answers, too ashamed to admit the full truth of her abandonment. Admitting that her own son had cast her aside felt like admitting to a failure deeper than any she had known. Still, the work gave Margaret a sense of purpose. She wasn't just surviving, she was contributing, and that alone helped keep the looming despair at bay. Every day, she stitched together garments for customers, mending seams in hemming dresses. But at night, when the shop closed and the silence settled in, Margaret's thoughts always returned to Richard. One evening, as she sat alone in her small motel room, the phone rang. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she dared to hope that it might be Richard. She rushed to the phone, her hand shaking as she picked it up. "Hello," she answered, her voice trembling with anticipation. "Margaret." The voice on the other end was not Richard's, but it was familiar. It was Peter, Richard's business associate, a man Margaret had only met once, briefly, during one of Richard's rare visits home. "Peter," she said, confused. "Why are you calling me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Peter finally spoke, his voice was strained. I need to speak with you. It's about Richard." Margaret's heart raced. Richard. The mention of his name sent a flood of emotions surging through her: anger, worry, confusion. Why was Peter calling about her son? And why now? "What's happened?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Peter hesitated, then spoke in a low, urgent tone. "I don't want to say too much over the phone. Can we meet? I'm in the city. It's important." Margaret's stomach churned with anxiety. Something was wrong. Deep down, she had known it for weeks, but hearing Peter's voice only confirmed her worst fears. She agreed to meet him the next morning at a nearby cafe. The rest of the night passed in a restless haze. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Was Richard in trouble? Had something happened to him? Or was there more to his abandonment than she realized? The next morning, Margaret arrived at the cafe early. She sat by the window, her hands clasped tightly around her cup of tea, watching the street outside for any sign of Peter. When he finally arrived, he looked worse for wear, his clothes rumpled, his face pale and drawn. "Margaret," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Thank you for meeting me." "Just tell me what's going on," Margaret replied, unable to contain her anxiety. Peter sighed heavily and leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I don't know how much Richard has told you, but things have been bad for him. Worse than you know." Margaret frowned. "I know he's been having problems with his business, but—" "It's more than that," Peter interrupted. He glanced around nervously before continuing. "Richard's in deep trouble. Financial trouble. He's in debt, massive debt, and he's been trying to fix things, but it's not going well." Margaret's heart sank. Debt. She had suspected that something was wrong with Richard's finances, but she had no idea it was this bad. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter rubbed his hands over his face, clearly distressed. "It's bad enough that he's desperate. He's borrowed money from some unsavory people. And now they're coming after him. If he can't pay them back, it won't end well for him." Margaret felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. This wasn't just about money anymore. If Richard was involved with dangerous people, his life could be at risk. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, her voice shaking. Peter looked at her with a mixture of pity and guilt. "He didn't want you to know. He thought he could handle it on his own. But now, things have spiraled out of control." Margaret's mind was reeling. Richard was in danger, and she had been left in the dark. But there was something else, something that didn't add up. "Why did he leave me here?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for weeks finally spilling out. "Why did he bring me to this city and then abandon me?" Peter's expression darkened, and he looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't want to tell you this, Margaret, but Richard thought he could use your assets. Your house, your savings. He was going to use them to pay off his debts." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her house. Her savings. The thing she had worked her entire life to build, the thing she had planned to leave to Richard one day, had been nothing more than pawns in his desperate game. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "He wouldn't do that. Not to me." "I'm sorry, Margaret," Peter said, his voice heavy with regret. "But he was planning it. He didn't see any other way out." The room seemed to spin around her as the full weight of Peter's words sank in. Richard hadn't just abandoned her, he had been planning to use her, to steal everything she had left in a last-ditch effort to save himself. And now that his plan had failed, he had left her behind, thinking she would be too weak, too old, to figure it out. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to cry in front of Peter. She felt sick to her stomach. How had it come to this? How had her son, the boy she had raised with love and care, turned into someone capable of such betrayal? "He was going to liquidate everything," Peter continued, his voice soft but firm. "Your house, your accounts, everything. But he couldn't." Something stopped him. Margaret's chest tightened. What stopped him? Peter hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I think someone else got to him first." Margaret frowned, her confusion deepening. "What do you mean?" "There's someone else involved. Someone powerful. I don't know who, but I know that Richard isn't just running from his debts. He's running from them." Margaret's pulse quickened. This was more than just financial trouble. Richard had crossed paths with someone dangerous, and now it wasn't just his life on the line, it was hers too. "I don't know the full story," Peter said, his voice tense. "But I know that Richard's not safe. And neither are you." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as Peter's words sank in. She had thought Richard's abandonment was the worst of it, but now it seemed that the situation was far more dangerous than she had imagined. Richard wasn't just running from his mistakes, he was running for his life. And in his desperation, he had tried to drag her down with him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret stared down at her hands, her mind racing as she tried to process everything she had just learned. "I need to find him," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I need to talk to him." Peter shook his head. "That's not a good idea, Margaret. Whoever he's involved with, they're dangerous. If you go after him, you could end up in the crossfire." "I don't care," Margaret said, her voice firm. "He's my son. I have to know why he did this." Peter hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll help you," he said. "But you need to be careful. If we're going to find Richard, we need to be smart about it." Margaret's jaw tightened as she nodded in agreement. She had been through too much to give up now. She wasn't going to let fear stop her from finding the truth. Richard had made his choices, but she wasn't going to let him go down this dark path alone. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. Over the next few days, Margaret and Peter worked together, trying to track down any leads on Richard's whereabouts. It wasn't easy, he had covered his tracks well. But little by little, they started to piece together a trail. They discovered that Richard had been meeting with a man named Victor Reyes, a notorious figure in the city's criminal underworld. Margaret's blood ran cold when she heard the name. Victor Reyes was known for his ruthless tactics, and if Richard owed him money, it was no wonder he had been so desperate. The more they learned, the clearer it became. Richard had gotten himself in over his head, and now he was paying the price. One evening, after another long day of searching, Margaret returned to her motel room, exhausted but determined. As she unlocked the door, she felt a strange sense of unease. Something was off. She stepped inside, and her heart stopped. The room had been ransacked. Her belongings were strewn across the floor, the drawers pulled out, the mattress flipped over. Someone had been here. Someone had been searching for something. Margaret's pulse quickened as she realized the full extent of the danger she was in. Whoever Richard had angered, they were now after her too. But what were they looking for? As Margaret stood in the wreckage of her motel room, a new sense of urgency gripped her. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. Her own life was now at risk. And she wasn't going to sit by and wait for them to come after her again. It was time to fight back. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway of her ransacked motel room, her heart hammering in her chest. Her world, already on shaky ground, had been torn apart yet again. The room was a disaster, clothes flung across the floor, drawers overturned, and her meager belongings strewn in every direction. Whoever had done this had been looking for something, and the message was clear: she was no longer just a bystander in Richard's game. She was a target. Her pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming at the back of her neck as the weight of it all crashed over her. This wasn't just about her son's debts or his betrayal anymore. They were coming for her. The shadows Richard had fallen into had now spread to consume her life as well. She had thought she could track him down, confront him, and perhaps even save him from his own reckless decisions. But now, standing in the ruins of her room, she realized just how dangerous and dire the situation had become. With trembling hands, Margaret stepped inside, surveying the wreckage. Whoever had done this had been thorough. They had searched everywhere, her suitcase torn open, her sewing kit spilled out onto the bed, even the small, worn photograph of Richard as a child was crumpled on the floor. The sight of that photo, so personal, so innocent, nearly broke her. She bent down to pick it up, her fingers shaking as she smoothed out the creases. For a moment, she stared at the smiling face of the boy she had once known, the boy she had raised and loved with everything she had. "What happened to you, Richard?" she thought, tears stinging her eyes. "How did we end up here?" But there was no time for grief, no time for self-pity. Margaret straightened, wiping away her tears. She couldn't afford to be weak now. Whoever had ransacked her room could return, and they wouldn't just stop at turning over her belongings the next time. They were searching for something, and whether she knew it or not, they believed she had it. Margaret quickly gathered her things, stuffing what little she had into her suitcase. She couldn't stay here. She needed to leave, now. But where would she go? She had no home, no safe place to hide, and the danger was closing in from all sides. The panic that had been simmering inside her for weeks now threatened to spill over, but she pushed it down. She had survived this far. She had to keep going. As she zipped up her suitcase, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She grabbed it, her heart pounding as she saw Peter's name flash on the screen. "They found me," Margaret said as soon as she answered, her voice taut with fear. There was a brief silence on the other end, then Peter's voice, low and urgent. "Margaret, listen to me carefully. You need to get out of there. Don't go back to the motel, don't stay in one place. Whoever is after Richard knows about you now, and they won't stop until they get what they want." "What do they want?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. "What could I possibly have that they're looking for?" "I don't know," Peter replied, his tone grim. "But they think you have something, information, money, something Richard left behind. And if they think you have it, they won't stop." Margaret's stomach dropped. She thought back to the days when Richard had visited her less and less, his phone calls becoming more curt, more distant. He had been hiding something, she had felt it then but hadn't known what. Now she feared it was something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice small and desperate. Peter hesitated for a moment, then spoke firmly. "Meet me at the old train station downtown. It's abandoned, but no one will look for you there. I'll help you figure this out. But be careful, Margaret. They're watching." Margaret nodded, even though Peter couldn't see her. "I'll be there." She hung up the phone, her heart racing. There was no time to waste. She couldn't afford another mistake, not when her life was hanging by a thread. The streets were dark and unfamiliar as Margaret made her way to the abandoned train station. Her suitcase felt heavier with each step, but she kept moving, forcing herself to stay alert. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant footstep made her jump. She couldn't help but look over her shoulder, convinced that someone was following her, though she saw no one. By the time she reached the station, her nerves were frayed. The building loomed ahead, its once grand facade crumbling and forgotten. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement, and the windows were boarded up. The place had an eerie stillness to it, as if it had been frozen in time, left behind just like her. Peter was already there, pacing by one of the pillars. When he saw her, he hurried over, his face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, scanning the area around them as if expecting danger to leap out from the shadows. Margaret nodded, though she didn't feel okay at all. "What's going on, Peter? Why are they after me?" Peter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Richard got mixed up with some very dangerous people. He borrowed money from them, and when he couldn't pay it back, he tried to cut a deal. But it fell apart. Now they think he hid something, money, documents, something valuable, and they think he gave it to you." Margaret's heart raced. "But I don't have anything. I don't even know what they're looking for." "I know," Peter said quickly. "But they don't believe that. They think you're the key to finding whatever Richard hid. And they'll stop at nothing to get it." Margaret felt a wave of fear crash over her. This was worse than she had imagined. She wasn't just caught in the middle of Richard's mistakes, she was now a target herself. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. Peter hesitated, then pulled something out of his jacket pocket. It was a small, worn envelope, sealed with tape. "Richard gave me this a few weeks ago, before everything went south. He told me to hold on to it in case something happened to him." Margaret stared at the envelope, her breath catching in her throat. Something had happened to him. Richard was on the run, and whatever was in that envelope was the reason why. Peter handed it to her, his expression serious. "I haven't opened it. I thought about it, but I didn't. It's yours. Maybe it can explain what's going on." Margaret's hands trembled as she took the envelope. For a moment, she hesitated, afraid of what she might find inside. But she couldn't turn back now. With shaking fingers, she carefully peeled back the tape and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Margaret unfolded it, her eyes scanning the page. As she read, her blood ran cold. It was a list, names, dates, and amounts of money, all linked to Richard. The people he had borrowed from, the deals he had made, and the staggering sums he owed. But that wasn't the worst part. At the bottom of the list, in Richard's handwriting, was a single line that made Margaret's heart stop. "If anything happens to me, they'll come after her." Horror. That was all it said. Not Mom or Margaret. Just her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Richard had known. He had known that his actions would put her in danger, and yet he had done nothing to stop it. He had led her here, left her vulnerable, and now she was paying the price for his mistakes. Margaret felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. The betrayal was complete. Richard hadn't just abandoned her, he had sacrificed her. He had used her as a pawn in his desperate attempt to save himself. She staggered backward, the paper falling from her hands as the weight of it all crashed down on her. Peter caught her before she could fall, his grip steadying her. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. "Are you all right?" "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No, I'm not." Tears welled in her eyes as the full magnitude of Richard's betrayal sank in. All this time, she had held on to the hope that she could find him, that she could save him from the darkness he had fallen into. But now she realized that he had been the one dragging her down all along. Margaret collapsed onto the bench, burying her face in her hands. She had spent her entire life giving everything to Richard, her love, her time, her sacrifices, and this was how he repaid her. With lies, with deception, with danger. Peter sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know it was this bad." Margaret shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "I thought I could fix it," she whispered. "I thought I could find him and make everything right. But I don't even know who he is anymore." She felt hollow, broken. The boy she had raised was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. And now, she was left with nothing but the pieces of a shattered life. For a long time, they sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Margaret's mind raced, replaying everything that had led to this point. She had been so blind, so trusting, and now she was paying the price for that trust. But as the tears dried on her cheeks, something shifted inside her. The pain, the betrayal, it was still there, still raw, but beneath it, a new feeling began to take shape. Anger. Richard had done this to her. He had used her, manipulated her, and put her life in danger. But she wasn't going to let him destroy her. Not anymore. Margaret straightened, wiping her eyes. Her heart still ached, but the fear that had gripped her for so long was starting to loosen its hold. She had survived too much to let this be the end. "I'm not going to run anymore," she said quietly, her voice steady. Peter looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Margaret said, standing up, "that I'm going to fight back. Richard made his choices, and now I have to make mine. I'm not going to let him or anyone else control my life anymore." Peter nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "What do you want to do?" Margaret took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I want to find Richard. I want to make him face what he's done." If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Margaret and Peter worked together, tracking down leads, following Richard's trail as best they could. It wasn't easy. Richard had covered his tracks well, but with each step, they got closer. Margaret's determination grew stronger with every passing day. She was no longer the frightened, abandoned woman who had been left to fend for herself. She was taking control of her life, of her fate, and she wasn't going to stop until she found the truth. The emotional toll was heavy. Every new piece of information they uncovered brought her closer to confronting the reality of who Richard had become. But Margaret was no longer afraid. The fear had been replaced by a burning desire for justice, justice for herself, for the life Richard had stolen from her, and for the lies he had built his world on. Finally, after days of searching, they found him. Richard had been hiding out in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, trying to stay one step ahead of the people he owed. When Margaret saw him for the first time in weeks, her heart clenched. He looked like a shadow of the man she had once known, his clothes disheveled, his face pale and gaunt, dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights spent running. But as he stood in the doorway, staring at her in shock, Margaret felt no sympathy. This was the man who had betrayed her, who had used her, who had put her life at risk. And now, it was time for him to face the consequences. "Mom," Richard said, his voice hoarse, "what are you doing here?" Margaret stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. "I'm here because of you, Richard. Because of what you've done. Richard's face paled further, and for the first time, Margaret saw something flicker in his eyes, fear. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he stammered, backing away. I was trying to fix things, I swear. You lied to me, Margaret interrupted, her voice firm. You used me. You put my life in danger, and you didn't care. You were willing to sacrifice everything, including me, just to save yourself. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked lost, like a child caught in a lie, but Margaret didn't relent. I loved you, Richard. I gave you everything I had. And this is how you repay me? With lies and betrayal? Tears welled in Richard's eyes, but Margaret felt no pity. She had shed enough tears for him already. I can fix this, Richard said, his voice cracking. I can make it right, I just need more time. No, Margaret said, cutting him off. You don't get more time. This is it. This is the end of the line. You need to face what you've done. Richard collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, Margaret saw him as he truly was, broken, lost, and desperate. But she wasn't here to save him anymore. She was here to save herself. I'm turning you in, she said quietly. It's the only way this ends. Richard looked up, his face pale with fear. You can't, Mom, please, I'm your son. You stopped being my son the day you decided to use me, Margaret said, her voice cold. I'm done protecting you. Richard's face crumpled, and for a moment, Margaret almost felt sorry for him. But then she remembered everything he had done, everything he had put her through, and the pity evaporated. This was her choice now. Her life. And she wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else take it from her again. As Margaret walked away from the apartment, the weight of what she had just done settled over her. She had confronted her son, faced the truth of his betrayal, and made the hardest decision of her life. It had nearly broken her, but she had survived. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would still be difficult, and the pain of Richard's actions would never fully fade, but she was free. Free from his lies, free from his manipulation, and free to rebuild her life on her own terms. As she stepped into the sunlight, Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the warmth on her face. She had fought for herself, for her life, and she had won. And that victory, no matter how painful, was hers. Margaret stood outside the courthouse, the crisp morning air cool against her skin. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest for weeks seemed to lift, just a little. The case against Richard was now in motion. It hadn't been easy turning in her own son, but Margaret had known deep down that it was the only way to finally sever the toxic thread that had bound her to him for so long. She had made the hardest choice of her life, and though it had left her bruised, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, she was no longer living in the shadow of Richard's choices. No longer waiting for him to change, no longer hoping to save him from himself. She had spent so much of her life being his protector, his provider, and in the end, his unwitting victim. Now, she was free. As she walked slowly down the courthouse steps, Margaret's thoughts drifted back to the moment she had handed over the evidence. The list of debts, the notes of betrayal, the proof of Richard's lies, it had all been a bitter pill to swallow. But in doing so, she had made a choice not only for herself but for the woman she had been before Richard's manipulation had taken root. She was reclaiming her life, piece by piece. Margaret knew that her decision wouldn't erase the pain. The betrayal of a son was a wound that might never fully heal. But standing there, with the weight of the legal battle beginning and the reality of Richard's fate settling in, she realized something important: she had changed. She was no longer the scared, vulnerable woman who had been left on a strange street corner, abandoned and confused. She had faced the darkest truths about her son, and she had survived. She had also learned something about herself that had been long buried. For years, she had defined herself by her role as a mother, measuring her worth by the successes and failures of her child. But now, for the first time in her life, Margaret was discovering who she was outside of that role. And in that discovery, she found strength. As she turned the corner, heading toward a small cafe where Peter had promised to meet her, Margaret felt a sense of quiet determination growing inside her. She had a life to rebuild, but this time, it would be on her own terms. The money Richard had tried to steal was being safeguarded now, and though much of it had been drained by his actions, there was enough left for her to start fresh. It wasn't about the money, though, it was about the freedom to choose her own path. She was no longer tied to Richard's endless cycle of manipulation. When Margaret entered the cafe, Peter was already sitting by the window, a coffee in front of him. He smiled as she approached, a look of quiet respect in his eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked as she sat down. Margaret paused for a moment, considering the question. There was no easy answer. Her heart still ached from the loss of Richard, from the realization that the son she had raised was lost to her in ways that went far beyond money or crime. But there was also a sense of relief, of lightness, that came from knowing she had taken control of her own fate. "I'm all right," she said, nodding. "Better than I was. It's going to take time, but I'm all right." Peter studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You've come a long way, Margaret. You've been through more than most people could handle." Margaret smiled, a small, genuine smile that she hadn't been able to summon in weeks. "I think I've learned how strong I really am." As they talked, the conversation moved away from Richard and toward the future. Margaret wasn't sure what that future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to embrace it. She was no longer defined by her past, by her mistakes, or by the son who had betrayed her. She had faced the darkest parts of her life and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. As the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the cafe, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected: hope. It was fragile, like the first bloom of spring after a long winter, but it was there. And with it came the understanding that, while she might not have won in every way, she had gained something far more important: herself. Margaret had been tested, broken, and nearly destroyed by Richard's actions. But now, standing on the other side of that storm, she realized she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more at peace with who she was. She hadn't just survived, she had grown. And as she sipped her coffee, watching the world go by outside, Margaret knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the quiet strength she had found within herself. If Margaret's journey moved you, then you're not alone. Her story of resilience and finding strength in the darkest moments reminds us that we all have the power to rise above. But now it's your turn. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay connected and get notified when our next story drops. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Comment below and let us know what part of Margaret's transformation resonated with you the most. Your thoughts are what keep this community alive, and we love hearing from each and every one of you. And finally, keep watching. The next story is already queued up just for you, another emotional journey that's sure to inspire. Click and dive into it now. Thanks for being here, and remember, our stories are just beginning. See you soon.